I'm going to introduce my guests. So here we have Ms. Kathrin Lorenz, Dr. Kathrin Lorenz, who is working for GIZ, the Association for International Cooperation, a very long title, but what exactly that means and what you're doing internationally in prevention work, she's going to tell us about in a minute. Also live in Cologne, Dario Schramm, 20 years old, student from Bergisch Gladbach. Maybe some of you have seen him. He is very well represented in the media. He is president of the country's student conference, working for students' rights, fighting for students' rights, and also fighting with a bad internet connection at his school as a student. And now I see the two ladies joining us safely from home. That's Pia Lamberty. She's a psychologist and expert for conspiracy ideologies. She's written a very nice book called Fake Facts, describing this phenomenon brilliantly. A sequel is about to appear called True Facts. I'm looking forward to talking to you. Joining us from Berlin. Also joining us from Berlin, Julia von Westerholt, president of the German Schools for the Public in Bonn. She has, and that's no joke, started her job exactly 1 year ago on April 1st in the midst of lockdown. How that worked out, I hope she's going to tell us in a minute. Ms. Lamberty, let's start with you. You professionally look at fake news and conspiracy ideologies, which have, in the media, have seen a boom during the pandemic that we've never seen before. How did this phenomenon develop? I can't hear Pia Lamberty. I hope you can hear her. Unfortunately, I can't hear her. Just keep talking. I hope that people watching the stream can hear you. Maybe I have to work with sign languages. Oh, okay. I'll just keep talking. Okay, now it's working. I just kept talking, hoping that it would work at some point. Okay, so let me try to answer your question. Yes, obviously, the issue has been discussed widely during the last year and differently as well. I've been looking at conspiracy ideologies for a long time. Before the pandemic, it was often an issue, like a niche issue, and people often kind of looked down on it. They said, oh, it's so crude, and they're just idiots, these people. And during the pandemic, it started gaining significance, and people realize it's not so funny, and it has an impact. I would say conspiracy ideologists have not increased, but what has changed is the networks. We have much greater conspiracy networks than before, when we had more insular phenomena. Millions of people can read about conspiracy content every day, about anti-Semitic content, about all kinds of conspiracy-related content. And I think what we've seen is that we need concepts how to handle conspiracy theories, because during the pandemic, sometimes it's due to conspiracy beliefs that people do not follow COVID measures. And that can obviously endanger our fight against the pandemic. There's also a lot of violent content, verbally and physically, and a lot of talk about enemies in science, politics, etc. So we need good concepts, and I'm very happy we're discussing it. So when you say in quantity it hasn't increased, has the quality changed through these networks that exist now? Yes, you could say that. If you look at the attacks on the press, there's twice as many between 2019 and 2020. And that was mainly due to conspiracy believers, also those who do not believe in COVID. So in December already, a police president in Berlin said there were more weapons at demonstrations and more violent attacks on vaccination centers. Sometimes vaccination centers have to stop working because there's violent demonstrators. So I would say, yes, it has changed, and there's greater pressure to become active. There's more radicalism, for sure. Could you explain why these conspiracy ideologies work so well, especially right now? Yes, overall, you can say that every crisis accelerates conspiracy trends. A crisis offers a space for projecting these ideologies, and it makes it easier for them to spread their ideas. There's different factors at play here. There's a loss of control people are experiencing, and it makes it easier to them to fall into the trap of conspiracy beliefs. You cannot control the situation objectively, so people in this situation start seeing patterns where there are none, and that quickly leads to esoteric explanations and conspiracy theories. Also, we know that people believe in conspiracies because it makes them feel better about themselves. If they have a strong need to feel unique, they're more likely to believe in conspiracy theories, and it makes you appear as a hero, as a person that really knows what's going on, while everybody else has no idea. And, you know, they are just sheep following the government or the press or whatever. And people are not good at dealing with abstract threats. You can see it in the area of climate change as well. You don't know how dangerous it actually is. With the COVID pandemic, it's similar. There's a virus and the consequences are unclear. Some people don't even notice that they're sick, and other people die. It has been the same during the Spanish flu, so it's difficult to assess this. And that makes people insecure, and they can create enemies and use it. And what can we do against this? For a long time, we've tried to actually get the operators of social networks and hold them responsible to keep their shop clean, so to speak. But what if there's content being censored that's not conspiracy content or fake news? What can we do in the long term to get this problem under control? Yes, with censorship, using that term, I'd be careful because it means states suppressing certain opinions. What the social networks are doing is not censorship, in my opinion. But of course, it's always the question, how much responsibility should we give to these companies, and what role does society play? We need to discuss this. The question of what we should do is important. It also depends on the level. Is it about the private level? What can I privately do? And what can I do at a societal level? On a societal level, I'm convinced, looking at the numbers, that we need standards. We need a clear line up to here and no further. If you cross this line, then society will react. It will be sanctioned by society. And I'm not just talking about criminal law, but, you know, like if you are wearing anti-Semitic symbols at a demo, then that's crossing the line. And setting these standards from a sociological point of view can do a lot more than you know, inviting conspiracy theorists to discuss things, because that just gives them a higher status. So I'd like to see more media education as well, and more understanding of scientific processes in society. But I'm talking about society as a whole. We're always looking at schools and talking about educating young people about media use, but adults need it just the same. So there's been a study in the US that showed that older people, older than 67, share fake news twice as often as young people. And a study in Germany showed in 2019, I think, that most older people don't even know that there are media education programs. There's a lot of focus on online programs focusing or targeted at young people, but I'd also like to see older people getting involved in this and getting training. Thank you, Ms. Lamberty. I'd like to pass on the question to Dario Schramm, who is at school, just about to graduate. What about the issue of fake news or conspiracy theories at school? Is it an issue or not? You have to look at this clearly. COVID was an accelerator. A lot of things moved into the digital space. A lot of knowledge had to be acquired privately by students. We were all surprised by the situation, by the pandemic and the safety net that should exist. How do I recognize a good source, for example? How do I recognize that something is actually serious? It was missing because it has not existed in education before, and during the pandemic it didn't suddenly come up. Young people were left alone on the internet, so you can imagine what happened. So do you talk about this at school? Is there like a subject to talk about it, or is there room given to it in other subjects to discuss this and maybe give you training? You should think so, but I think the big problem is that during the pandemic, a lot has been lost. A lot of people are just busy trying to catch up on content that they've missed, that they couldn't learn at school. So there's no room for thinking about fundamental general issues like that. So I think, sure, individual teachers maybe have these thoughts to not just teach students maths, but teach them how to learn it. So individually, yes, room has been given to it, but there's no general space given to it. Ms. Lorenz, you were taking notes. How do you see the subject? First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to the opening panel of the Congress on Crime Prevention, and congratulations to the event for facing and tackling the issue of education. I think it's very important. So in my notes, I've approached the question of what competencies do we need? What new competencies do we need and do young people need in this situation? And what competencies, and that's also what our work is about, do people in our partner countries we're working with need when we do development aid? To tackle these challenges that make them vulnerable to violence or issues we're talking about today. So how do we help them work in prevention? I think that's a very important focus during these 2 days. What competencies do we need for prevention? What competencies can we promote at school, as Mr. Schramm said, that we haven't really tackled over the past few years, and that we can't really tackle now during the pandemic because students have been at home, and especially a lot of social competencies and emotional competencies totally went under. Can you name one or two you find important? Maybe I'll give you some numbers. Worldwide, there's 1.5 million students that could not go to school during the pandemic. So the situation is not just happening in Germany. We have homeschooling here, so at least we can keep working on the core subjects, but not on social skills. And a lot of young people right now, we're already talking about a lost generation. They are not learning social competencies. They're not learning to discuss or fight about things at school. And another thing, yesterday or the day before, we've seen the first numbers for Germany. And while the kids are at home, at home, it's not easy either. I think domestic violence has risen by 20%, as we've seen this Saturday. I think that was a number for Brandenburg. In our partner countries, obviously, we often don't know the numbers. But I think the situation, the frustration level has gone up terribly during the pandemic. So Ms. von Westerholt said, "Oh, I know that you're working on certain courses you're offering at your schools for the public in this context." Yes, we have different courses, but I'd like to talk about some other points that have now been mentioned. So I like that Mr. Schramm said the general fundamental thinking is missing. I think that's what we've really seen during the pandemic. We have so much in this country, in Germany, so many players, so many good ideas, and so many concepts and experts and expertise everywhere. And the crisis has pointed this out, that we're living in a federally organized country. When it comes to the health care system, the question of what masks to wear when we leave the house. And the pandemic has also shown how difficult it is in such a situation for students all over the country, or for people wanting education or needing access to education. How can we create this access in an increasingly digitized age? We are facing major challenges in this area, because digitization is always centralization as well, moving away from federalism, especially for a country like Germany. That's a special challenge. So I like this idea of a general fundamental way of thinking that Mr. Schramm mentioned. So what else does a crisis show? It also shows what is not working well. If something's working, we don't notice because it's working. So I'd like to say the crisis has given us many challenges, but we also have luxury problems. I agree with Ms. Lorenz. There's different situations in ours. Obviously, I don't want to belittle our problems. We have big problems to solve, but in other countries, it's often much more difficult. The crisis shows when something doesn't work. A lot of things are working. We need more networking between different players. The schools for the public are one of the players in this network. Last year, we've given a proposal of a partnership to the government, and we said we need a connection with schools. We can offer a lot of support to regular schools this summer, and we're happy that this partnership is being realized, and that we were able to predict this so well last year, that this would be an issue for schools for the public. So culture makes people strong is a new problem that we're going to use to promote social competencies during our summer programs and beyond, in the context of Corona education. It's a specific program targeted at the situation. I think social competencies are very important and should not be underestimated. That young people have been at home for most of a year and have been forced to catch up and deal with the situation. As adults, we can also see this during video conferences. We can't have a coffee break with colleagues. Imagine what it must be like for students who can't send each other messages on small scraps of paper. I mean, at least we were doing that during my school days. I don't know if people are still doing that. But this entire informal exchange is missing, and we're all longing for it. What am I trying to say? We have a lot of players. The schools for the public are one of them. I could name a lot of others. But I think the most important thing we've learned is networking and working together. Like all players working together has to be promoted much more strongly, and the digital space is offering us opportunities for it that we've discovered during the pandemic, that we don't actually have to make very complex plans or get together, that we can actually very quickly connect and work on proposals and concepts and build up pressure, maybe also with election criteria, as you mentioned. We have to work together more and point out problems and maybe suggest approaches or solutions to become a more general, fundamental idea. Is that how you started a year ago? I imagine, you know, the unknown situation of lockdown, starting a new job in empty offices, just like us now on an empty stage with nobody in the room. How did you manage the school? How did you start your job? Well, this is actually the truth. I have great colleagues, and our core team also got together at the office, actually. And we keep doing this. Obviously, we're doing more home office work, but some things can only be solved on site, obviously, while sticking to hygiene measures. But I had a great team, and I just joked about this at the beginning. But, you know, maybe it's true. I was working for the Red Cross before, which is a crisis management institution, one of the biggest worldwide. So maybe that has been a major influence on me and has prepared me well for dealing with emergency and keeping calm. I think what has actually been important for everybody who started back then was to keep calm and, you know, tell ourselves we'll get over this crisis, we'll get through it, and there's no way around it. So yes, good team, and I did work a lot, I have to say. I've had a major learning curve during that time, also through the constant digital exchange. I've maybe got in touch with many more people than I usually would have. It's probably sped up my getting into the work. Yes, I think without the pandemic, we wouldn't have learned so much in the area of digitization, and that's a great advantage for our society as a whole. I think people forget this point. And how far has this influenced your work at schools for the public, maybe long-term even? Yes, not just during this 1 year, but in the long term. There's 900 schools for the public in Germany and branch offices on top of that. And these 900 schools, so far in the public's perception, were strongly characterized by their local characteristics. Maybe a lot of you know these thick books that we put in bookshops or at town halls, so people could look at them, what classes we were offering. And last year we've moved a lot of that online. We've been lucky that since 2018 we've actually had an online platform. We call it the VHS Cloud. And in this cloud, we've actually already done classes, and we keep doing them. There's forums, there's materials, there's exchange between teachers, and we've seen a lot more activity in this area because there's obviously been a much greater need for it during this year. So we were very grateful that we had this cloud already. And so what this changes for us as an office is that this cloud has just blown up. It's, we've seen a huge learning curve. You know, we thought, yeah, we have this tool, great, we'll try to work with it, but we never thought that it would be such a major platform to work with. And obviously we have to elaborate on it and add a lot more features. A lot of schools have seen how easy it is, and that it's much less complicated. Just like with home office work, we always thought it would be so difficult, but it's not so difficult. So schools for the public have started to develop new ideas, And now we have to use this momentum to enter a new era and navigate it. So as Schools for the Public, looking at the election, we've asked for much more education in a political sense, because obviously we can't go back to the beginning, to where we were. To the contrary, we have to use the momentum to move on into the future and create a digital education landscape in Germany, not just have individual online classes, but to make it a normal way of learning. Mr. Schramm, is it the same at your school? I think I'd like to stress one thing, because we're at the Prevention Congress here, and it's an important aspect. You just said it too. This need for social contact is huge. And I think that on the one hand, it's not a good situation, but it's also a dangerous situation, because what we're seeing is that young people who, are maybe not very educated, which is the case in many cases, and they are so keen to meet others. And there's a lot of studies about this. Those people are vulnerable to, get drawn into conspiracy theories, etc. Especially during the pandemic, where people are at home and you're not meeting others. We have to be careful that this area is not used to drag people into areas that they cannot control or that they cannot assess. So you've seen regular school before the pandemic, and you've seen school during the pandemic. What has changed since the pandemic for you? I think school as a whole, for over a year, we're very good at recognizing the major problems. You don't even have to be at school. You can just see problems even from the outside. That's what we've learned. Obviously, digitization is a major topic, but what's missing is that we tackle the problem. We can recognize the problem, but, it has been mentioned, we need communication. And now we know what's the problem. Now we have to implement solutions. Who could do this? Do you have any ideas? Well, the federal system is, it's always a question of responsibilities. What we're seeing during the entire pandemic, whether it's about vaccination or other things, is that we're good at saying, especially in politics, yeah, we'd like to, but it's not our area of responsibility. It's very simple. I've seen this at school a lot. The word is just sitting together and talking to each other. And a lot of people have difficulties with this. There is money. It's not an issue of money. What the problem is most of the time in education is that the government has to sit together with the state governments and the communities to decide how to spend the money effectively. So it's a good start to sit together. Dr. Lorenz, you have children that go to school. As a mother, how do you see this? I'm surprised to hear this question, but yes, I think a lot of things has to happen within families. And, politicians are placing their hopes in families. And I'd like to talk about this area of problems. What happens to socially disadvantaged kids? Schools cannot solve these problems on their own. What additional offers can we make? How can we make families stronger? So I think schools for the public are a very good entrance point or a good point of access to tackle this issue. We have to look at what offers we can make outside of schools, clubs, music, sports. How can we implement COVID protection measures in order to make these offers work again? And so our children and our young people can learn for life again, sing in the choir, do sports, etc. I would like to see that happening. And one more thing I'd like to see is that kids can actually go on school trips. maybe at least next year or the year after. I got this idea from a friend. I truly believe we need the social friction, the spontaneity, and actual contact rather than just the controlled online spaces we're moving in. And, you know, just being inside your own bubble. Still, in spite of all the problems the pandemic has brought us, Mr. Schramm, do you see advantages concerning the education system, how it could maybe benefit from the situation? Yes, maybe some advantages are, you know, like people always talk about the pandemic making things more visible. Digitization is the key word. What we must not forget as well is when it comes to digitization and digital learning, schools have to be modernized. That's the most important point people tend to forget. We're talking about hardware and whatever we need, but the problem is that it's hard to imagine, but you know, schools actually need proper internet connection, and in a lot of cases, they have to be modernized, and education has to be fundamentally changed. And what we can learn from the pandemic, you know, it depends on what we make out of it. Any concrete things you'd like to see? I believe digitization is a thing where the education gap that already existed before the pandemic is increasing. It has never actually, it's always mattered what kind of background you came from, you know, in your education career. And there are models for digitization that could help us fight against this trend and actually open up more opportunities to socially disadvantaged people. Bitkom just did a survey confirming this, saying parents would like to see more digitization, better equipment at schools, but also better training for teachers. For a long time, we've bashed teachers, telling them they need to get more training, or schools should provide more training. Is the problem actually the teachers, or is there just no internet connection? My mother is a teacher, so, you know, don't bash the teachers, but that's actually not the problem. A lot of teachers have used old-fashioned and outdated methods to teach us, but the problem is that they don't get enough training. And once again, all over the country, we need it. Some young teachers find tools for themselves and educate themselves, but that's an individual level. We don't have the general fundamental step forward. It's just happening on an individual level. I'm sure it's not due to individual teachers. We need to promote teacher training in general. Another issue we've been seeing during the pandemic, before too, but maybe Ms. Lamberty can say more about the quantity of this, is about hatred, hate speech. Mr. Schramm has also experienced this. How do you deal with that? You often become the target of hate speech. How do you deal with it? Let me talk about the issue we discussed before, but then I'll answer your question. So I think what we are lacking is a vision for the digital area. We always use this problem-oriented path. Obviously, schools are closed, etc. But I think I did a distance learning degree in sociology in Hagen, at the University of Hagen, and it works, and it can be social. I had a great group of other students, and we supported each other. It's possible. And also what Mr. Schramm said, it's possible to fight the education gap, because suddenly people were able to study, even though they did not live in a big city. We had lots of mothers on parental leave that otherwise could not have studied anything, and then they got a psychology degree. It's great for kids that get bullied, maybe, you know, kids that have social anxiety. So I think we need a vision. How can this work? How can we create safe digital spaces that promote people's free expression? But now, what is happening right now is that online there's a lot of hate speech, and digital spaces are not safe. People who publicly make statements become the targets of hate crime. I have become the target of hate crime during the pandemic, especially anti-Semitic content, threats to my life. I've obviously sued some people, mostly unsuccessfully. And I feel that we're still at a point where people believe hatred belongs to online life. But I don't believe that's the case. I think we need a better vision. We have to create a vision of an internet without hate speech. And social networks are obviously partly responsible, but individuals are also responsible to reflect on their statements and also be courageous online if people are attacked. How do you see this, Mr. Schramm, when you are attacked personally? Well, there was this great wave of attacks, when it was about testing duty at school, where a lot of people have made statements that don't believe in the danger of the virus. And Ms. Lamberty and we just become the targets of everybody's hatred. There's a lot of smaller level student representatives. I mean, I have a good network that can be a buffer against this kind of attack. But, the other student representatives, 15, 16 years old, have approached me and said, we wanted COVID tests to become obligatory at school, and people have bashed us and bullied us as a consequence and threatened my life. Threatened to kill me online. So this is something where during the pandemic we should have taken a closer look at our young people. It's a great topic for prevention. Ms. Lamberty just mentioned an interesting point I'd like to pass on to Ms. von Westerholt. You told me earlier that the digital education can also and make it possible for people to participate in classes that were not able to participate before. Can you give us examples of what kind of people use these offers? Yes, or maybe the other way around. We had online classes. We moved some classroom teaching online, but a lot of schools use this time to create new formats inside their overall program as alternatives to classroom teaching. So obviously right now that's our normal format of teaching. And beyond that, we've developed a lot of tools even beforehand that have played a special role during the time of the pandemic. The VHS Learning Portal, for example, which is to promote integration and school graduation classes. That's the only digital platform that's actually officially registered and authorized to offer this kind of teaching. And we've seen a lot of people participating in this during the pandemic. What we've developed during the pandemic as well at our schools for the public is an app called Stadt-Land-Datenfluss, and the Chancellor has supported this project. The goal is to increase data sovereignty of the citizens. So it's basically a learning app, but it's a little bit more playful. Obviously, yes, you are learning a lot, but yeah, we call this a gamification approach. So you basically playfully acquire the content. And this app accompanies classes at our schools. So, for example, there was one class on health education. It's a huge area of our program where we discussed the issue of what happens to my data if I have a wearable, a fitness watch that saves my data. What happens to them? Are they safe? What are they useful for? It's not just a consumer's perspective, telling people to make sure their data are not stolen. That's not the only approach. It's also about explaining what is it good for? What positive effects can it have in mobility, for example? How can we use this? Maybe a tram is weighed while it is driving at the different tram stops. What's the point? So it can send data to my smartphone and tell me that it's packed and I should take the next one. So it should be a perspective for the future, maybe in the area of mobility. So we're offering these formats, these apps, and providing them to students. A lot of our schools have developed creative formats like this that the pandemic basically offered through its challenges. So the crisis has shown us a lot of areas where we could make improvements, and that's been an opportunity. Because oftentimes we only realize something didn't work when it's too late. But now we've been able to pinpoint issues like hate speech, fake news, etc. And now we have to think about what can we do to be better equipped to fight against this after. Yes, in Germany, I feel that we have a tendency to complain, but abroad, Ms. Lorenz, with GIZ, when you do development cooperation, I imagine this to be much more difficult in poorer countries. Yes, in many countries, the problems in connection with the COVID crisis are totally different. It's about questions like, if I don't have a job, I can't feed my children. So it's much closer to survival questions than here. So our work is marked by, especially in prevention, 62% of people in Africa are under 25. So if we're doing prevention work, then obviously it's about young people. So that's our target group, apart from the subject of this Congress or the pandemic. And the other point that influences our employees is that we're doing a lot in prevention work with players outside of school, with civil society, with organizations and groups we are supporting that are working with target groups on site. The pandemic has had other effects, and you can see autocratization trends in some countries, which influences the work of these players, working with people that really have to get rid of frustrations during this pandemic and that really need safe spaces. Has that changed over the past year? Because I imagine if you go there as a German organization, maybe you have a good reputation in most countries, but maybe not everywhere. Yes, this has also changed the question of how countries support our countries' development cooperation. Obviously, there's tendencies we have to watch out for, and our partners in these countries obviously have to observe lockdowns and social distancing measures, etc. That makes their work much more difficult. Young people globally are networking digitally, so you often manage to reach your target group, but building up safe spaces for exchange in the real world has become more difficult. So, and they've been, or sports and music, hip-hop, rap, offers like that are possible online, but it's much more complicated. And in some countries where this type of work is becoming much more difficult. Are there maybe things we can learn from other countries where we can say, oh, there's great things happening, that we could do this here? Yes, I'm glad to see this exchange happening here at the Congress. We are going to have a panel on young people in cyberspace and violence tomorrow. I think it's growing together more. I wouldn't say like the projects we've done years ago somewhere else, we should take them here. But what we should be aware of is that things are growing together, that young people, in their positive spirit, in their will to educate themselves and learn, and also in connection with fake news and hate speech and radicalization. Obviously, people are using digitization for that purpose too, so exchange is becoming even more important. I think the world is growing together. Things are happening everywhere. The pandemic has shown this too. We have a few questions from our viewers. I didn't see them earlier. Sorry about that. Let me start. There was a question to Mr. Schramm. Corona bonus for students. Should we grant it to students or not? Should we give them a sort of handicap because they couldn't go to school? Or maybe some of them were socially disadvantaged anyway and have been able to study as well. What's your position on this? We've looked at this position from the beginning of the pandemic. How can we deal with this during the pandemic? And I think it's very difficult to find an answer to that, because the problem is that everybody worked individually, and some people have been able to prepare themselves for their exams, and others haven't been able to do this so well. And I think people's grades are not comparable anyway, but during the pandemic it's become even more uneven. But I think what's more important than people's grades is their job opportunities afterwards that we need to look at. I think the government has invested a lot in education and vocational training. Obviously, there's people going to university too, but I think that's more important. That once people finish school, what opportunities do they have then? That's more important than grades. Another question to Ms. Lorenz. The question is, how do you want to implement this in the long term, the structural implementation on site? Yes, that's basically imminent in our way of working. We're also working with people in 112 countries, but the main part of our work, and especially what we're doing locally with partner organizations, we're already doing with people on site who know the local setting and know how far you can go concerning certain subjects. Talking about prevention work, I talked about domestic violence initially. These subjects we're working on are transformative subjects, and it's not always an entire society of a country standing behind it. So you have to know locally how far you can go and what you can do. And I believe it's the most important point to support local partners on site. I talked about partners from civil society, but also climate protection programs. Sometimes it's government partners to make structural change and support them in what they're trying to implement in their countries, rather than telling them what to do with our German mentality. So people on site who know how things work there are crucial. Yes, they're crucial. Without them, we cannot implement sustainable change. Projects are developed on site and implemented on site. That's the core of our work. It's also a major challenge, but without these partners and the willingness to work on these issues globally, we will not be able to implement change sustainably and structurally. How important is your work, your local work in those countries? For us in Germany, yes, I think you mentioned Mr. Drosten initially, who, telling us the summer it could be good. The WHO quote, "Nobody in the world is safe until everybody's safe." I think the WHO said in connection with the pandemic. How important is our work? It's the totality of the work. We are doing one part, capacity development, close to the target groups. But what I also think is a multilateral world, a global perspective, and designing the future of globalization is important for all of us. I don't have to discuss climate, etc. We all know what we're talking about here. Everything is growing together, as we mentioned earlier, and the problems can be solved as problems that have global consequences. So if we don't solve them here, then it'll come back to us like a boomerang. Yes, I think everything we're not designing or solving together as a future of our planet obviously is going to impact us and our lives here as well. So I think international politics with a global focus is important in prevention, but also in other areas like climate or health, a health crisis. It's all the more important. Can you name a concrete project that you're implementing on site that you think is great, doing great prevention work? I just mentioned the word hip hop. Before I was doing this job, I was working in Palestine for GIZ with young people living in refugee camps and growing up there, living very close together, even independent of the pandemic, and having little space to express themselves, and we introduced hip-hop music, trying to approach them with issues that they liked anyway, and we've had great experiences with this. We talked about lyrics, we developed new lyrics together, made music together, and that was a way of discussing problems and worries that they were experiencing in their lives. And from my perspective, I can say that this is a great way of getting kids involved, getting them together, and getting out of this closed space in their thoughts and freeing themselves from it. Another invitation to you as viewers to ask questions. Please send us your questions and we'll pass them on to our speakers. We're approaching the end of the discussion, but Pia Lamberty, I'd like to ask you for concrete ideas, concrete solutions when it comes to conspiracy ideologies. 2 or 3 concrete ideas where you would say, that's what I'd like to see, and I'd like to see things moving quickly. Okay, I think what I would like to see is a more active civil society, not just in conspiracy theories with racism, anti-Semitism. I see again and again how these narratives trickle into society and people don't position themselves clearly. For a year, we've talked about COVID deniers, and it was similar to talking about extreme right-wing radicals, and we try to approach them as victims, like those poor people, who knows what their background is. But COVID deniers has a lot of connections to right-wing ideas, and we need to take a clear position against this as a society. It happens sometimes, but not not in general. And we actively have to go against this as a society. I want young people to learn this. Who can I turn to when things like this happen, to get support, and also to learn to say no, or to go against the grain, or against hatred and hate speech. I also believe we need more knowledge about how can I recognize good sources. How does science work? What does it mean if scientist A says this, but everybody else says something else? Is there something like scientific consensus? Once again, not only at school, but society as a whole has to learn about this. I don't think this is going to prevent people from believing in conspiracy theories. There won't be fewer believers, but the rest of society will be stronger to fight it. And, people feel less safe when they encounter conspiracy theories. Maybe they are less inclined to get vaccinations, etc. So we need to fight this sort of misinformation and build up support structures for education in a positive sense. A lot of young people whose parents are COVID deniers are completely being left alone with this situation. And, people tell them you can't go get therapy. So we need support institutions for people like that, because, we have the elections ahead of us in the area of climate change. We have to deal with this. So we need to develop resilience as a society, as a whole. There's one more question, two, kind of, I'd like to pass on to you from our viewers. The question and the social networks, a lot of people are hiding behind an anonymous profile, and there's more distance on a Facebook profile or on Twitter. Maybe I'd write different things from what I would say into your face here on stage. So a network, why is there no network that makes it obligatory for people to use their real names? I hope we'll never have it, actually. I'm opposed to that. For one thing, you have to see the internet should be free space. Maybe giving room to people being discriminated or oppressed to express their opinion. If you're living in a small village and you're gay and you want to talk about your experience, and you don't want to use your name, then I would like to give this person space to do that. And beyond Germany, and remaining anonymous can be very important for people who are politically or otherwise persecuted. And people in Germany do not write threats or hate speech anonymously. No, they use their real names. I get threats from people with their names. Karl Lauterbach also wrote that he was threatened to be killed by people using their real names. An anti-Semitism researcher has been looking at this for years. No, it's Dr. So-and-so signing this because they no longer have any inhibitions. On Telegram, it's the same. People see there's no regulation, there's no consequences. If they state their opinion, they do not have to hide. They can say what they want. So regulation, would that be effective? If that would actually be a criminal deed officially? Yes, it is actually. It's illegal to insult people online or offline. It's just often not persecuted. Attila Hildmann, for example, on his channel, he had attacked me in May or June last year, Attila Hildmann is in Turkey now, and the data have not been evaluated. It was all too late, and that's the experience lots of people make, online or offline, that they're being left alone with their experience of being attacked. That they do not perceive the police as trustworthy. We've seen racist networks inside the police over the past few years, or there's no sensitivity in these areas. So I think it's important that we have institutions that educate people on this issue, on how to deal with hate crime. So rules and laws are there, but they're not being implemented or enforced. And there's a lack of basic understanding for the fact that what happens online is real. It's not that we have a real world and an online world. No, the internet is the real world. And if something happens in it, then it's happening in the real world, and it should have real consequences for people. We just heard about those young student representatives that were attacked. And I know a scientist who doesn't want to publish her study because she's afraid of hate speech. So we need an understanding and awareness for this. We are at a very low level of understanding. We need to understand that the internet is real. So we're approaching the end. We have 2 minutes left. One more question, one final round with all of you. I know in reality it doesn't work this way, but still, you can all send a fax to the Chancellor with one wish to the politicians that they will fulfill. I think in Germany a fax is always good. Dr. Lorenz, what would you wish for? I'm a private person. As a private person, I'd wish for something else. From the GIZ perspectives, I'd like to see things approached more globally. Obviously, during the pandemic, we've been looking at our own country, or maybe even our own area, and the numbers, and at Germany's borders, or where can we travel. I think it's very important overall to during the pandemic and to think about prevention from a global perspective. Mr. Schramm, your fax. Very simple. I just tell her not just only in the area of education, but look at who is affected and invite everybody to communicate with each other. And as an influencer in this context, put everybody together on one table. Ms. Lamberty. One wish, one fax. I think I would want to see social threats like conspiracy theories and right-wing extremism to be taken seriously, and that we take it seriously and look at it before something happens. We should have done this. A lot of things don't happen out of the blue. For example, false vaccination, IDs, etc. Think about this beforehand. Prevention work. Ms. van Westerholt, I think I would actually use a sentence from the Cologne Declaration. Education should be taken much more seriously in our society, not only in individual areas of life or individual institutions, but it should be considered a basic building block in an individual's career and life. Everybody should have access to education in an increasingly digitized work to develop as a citizen. Thank you so much, Julia van Westerholt, Pia Lamberty, joining us from home, Dr. Kathrin Lorenz and Dario Schramm here in Cologne. Thank you so much.